Chapter 31 of A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jude Cater. A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln by John G. Nicolay. Chapter 31. Shaping of the Presidential Campaign. Criticisms of Mr. Lincoln. Chase's Presidential Ambitions. The Pomeroy Circular. Cleveland Connection. Attempt to nominate Grant. Meeting of Baltimore Convention. Lincoln's letter to Schurz. Platform of Republican Convention. Lincoln renominated. Refuses to indicate preference for Vice President. Johnson nominated for Vice President. Lincoln's speech to Committee of Notification. Reference to Mexico in his letter of acceptance. The French in Mexico. The final shaping of the campaign, the definition of the issues, the wording of the platforms, and the selection of the candidates had grown much more out of national politics than out of mere party combination or personal intrigues. The success of the war and the fate of the Union, of course, dominated every other consideration. And next to this, the treatment of the slavery question became in 100 forms almost a direct personal interest. Mere party feeling, which had utterly vanished for a few months in the first grand uprising of the North, had been once more awakened by the first Bull Run defeat, and from that time onward was heard in a loud and constant criticism of Mr. Lincoln and the acts of his supporters whenever they touched the institution of slavery. The Democratic party, which had been allied with the Southern politicians in the interests of that institution through so many decades, quite naturally took up its habitual role of protest that slavery should receive no hurt or damage from the incidents of war, where, in the border states, it still had constitutional existence among loyal Union men. On the other hand, among Republicans who had elected Mr. Lincoln, and who, as a partisan duty, endorsed and sustained his measures, Frémont's proclamation of military emancipation in the first year of the war excited the over-hasty zeal of anti-slavery extremists, and developed a small but very active faction which harshly denounced the President when Mr. Lincoln revoked that premature and ill-considered measure. No matter what the President subsequently did about slavery, the Democratic press and partisans always assailed him for doing too much, while the Frémont press and partisans accused him of doing too little. Meanwhile, personal considerations were playing their minor but not unimportant parts. When McClellan was called to Washington, enduring all the hopeful promise of the great victories he was expected to win, a few shrewd New York Democratic politicians grouped themselves about him, and put him in training as the future Democratic candidate for president, and the general fell easily into their plans and ambitions. Even after he had demonstrated his military incapacity, when he had reaped defeat instead of victory, and earned humiliation instead of triumph, his partisan adherents clung to the desperate hope that though they could not win applause for him as a conqueror, they might yet create public sympathy in his behalf as a neglected and persecuted genius. The cabinets of presidents frequently develop rival presidential aspirants, and that of Mr. Lincoln was no exception. Considering the strong men who composed it, the only wonder is that there was so little friction among them. They disagreed constantly and heartily on minor questions, both with Mr. Lincoln and with each other, but their great devotion to the Union, coupled with his kindly forbearance, and the clear vision which assured him mastery over himself and others, kept peace and even personal affection in his strangely assorted official family. The man who developed the most serious presidential aspirations was Salmon P. Chase, his Secretary of the Treasury, who listened to and actively encouraged the overtures of a small faction of the Republican Party which rallied about him at the end of the year 1863. Pure and disinterested, and devoted with all his energies and powers to the cause of the Union, he was yet singularly ignorant of the current public thought, and absolutely incapable of judging men in their true relations. He regarded himself as the friend of Mr. Lincoln, and made strong protestations to him and to others of this friendship. But he held so poor an opinion of the President's intellect and character, compared with his own, that he could not believe the people blind enough to prefer the President to himself. He imagined that he did not covet advancement, and was anxious only for the public good, yet in the midst of his enormous labors found time to write letters to every part of the country, protesting his indifference to the presidency, but indicating his willingness to accept it, and painting pictures so dark of the chaotic state of affairs in the government that the irresistible inference was that only he could save the country. From the beginning, Mr. Lincoln had been aware of this quasi-candidacy, which continued all through the winter. Indeed, it was impossible to remain unconscious of it, although he discouraged all conversation on the subject, and refused to read letters relating to it. He had his own opinion of the taste and judgment displayed by Mr. Chase in his criticisms of the President and his colleagues in the cabinet, but he took no note of them. "I have determined," he said, "to shut my eyes, so far as possible, to everything of the sort. Mr. Chase makes a good secretary, and I shall keep him where he is. If he becomes President, all right. I hope we may never have a worse man." And he went on, appointing Mr. Chase's partisans and adherents to places in the government. Although his own renomination was a matter in regard to which he refused to talk much, even with intimate friends, he was perfectly aware of the true drift of things. In capacity of appreciating popular currents, Chase was a child beside him, and he allowed the opposition to himself in his own cabinet to continue, without question or remark, all the more patiently because he knew how feeble it really was. The movement in favor of Mr. Chase culminated in the month of February, 1864, in a secret circular signed by Senator Pomeroy of Kansas, and widely circulated through the Union, which criticized Mr. Lincoln's tendency toward compromises and temporary expedients, explained that even if his reelection were desirable, it was practically impossible in the face of the opposition that had developed, and lauded Chase as the statesman best fitted to rescue the country from present perils and guard it against future ills. Of course, copies of this circular soon reached the White House, but Mr. Lincoln refused to look at them, and they accumulated unread in the desk of his secretary. Finally, it got into print, whereupon Mr. Chase wrote to the President to assure him he had no knowledge of the letter before seeing it in the papers. To this, Mr. Lincoln replied, "I was not shocked or surprised by the appearance of the letter, because I had had knowledge of Mr. Pomeroy's committee, and of secret issues which I supposed came from it, for several weeks. I have known just as little of these things as my friends have allowed me to know. I fully concur with you that neither of us can be justly held responsible for what our respective friends may do without our instigation or countenance. Whether you shall remain at the head of the Treasury Department is a question which I will not allow myself to consider from any standpoint other than my judgment of the public service, and, in that view, I do not perceive occasion for a change." Even before the President wrote this letter, Mr. Chase's candidacy had passed out of sight. In fact, it never really existed save in the imagination of the Secretary of the Treasury and a narrow circle of his adherents. He was by no means the choice of the body of radicals who were discontented with Mr. Lincoln because of his deliberation in dealing with the slavery question, or of those others who thought he was going entirely too fast and too far. Both these factions, alarmed at the multiplying signs which foretold his triumphant renomination, issued calls for a mass convention of the people to meet at Cleveland, Ohio, on May 31, a week before the assembling of the Republican National